has been burned into the consciousness of the Israeli military establishment for decades, and when you understand why, everything else starts to make sense. Go back to the year 2000. Israel had occupied southern Lebanon for 18 years. 18 years of checkpoints, settlements, proxy forces, and the kind of grinding occupation that breaks people or hardens them. In May of that year, under sustained pressure from Hezbollah's guerrilla campaign, Israel withdrew. And Hezbollah's then Secretary General Hassan Nasrallah traveled to Bint Jbeil to deliver what would become one of the most famous speeches in modern Arab political history. From a small soccer stadium in that town, he told the Arab world that Israel was, quote, weaker than a spider's web. That speech in Bint Jbeil has been burned into the minds of Israeli military and political leadership ever since. It became the rallying cry, not just for Hezbollah, but for every resistance movement across the region that believed a superpower-backed military could be confronted and made to retreat. Now fast forward to 2006. Israel went back into Lebanon during the Second Lebanon War, and one of its stated objectives was to plant a flag in Bint Jbeil, to erase Nasrallah's speech symbolically by occupying the very ground where it was delivered. In 2006, Israeli Brigadier General Gal Hirsch declared publicly that Israel had complete control over Bint Jbeil. That claim was later discredited after evidence emerged showing that 3 separate pushes to seize the village had failed, despite a heavy Israeli presence surrounding it. The battle became one of the bloodiest engagements of that war. Israeli soldiers were killed in ambushes, in close quarters, urban fighting, in exactly the kind of terrain that Hezbollah had spent years preparing. When the ceasefire came, Bint Jbeil was still standing, Hezbollah was still there, and Nasrallah's speech echoed louder than ever. So now we are in 2026, and history is repeating itself in ways that should make every serious student of geopolitics stop and think very carefully. On February 28, 2026, Israel and the United States launched a war against Iran, Hezbollah's main backer, and assassinated Iranian Supreme Leader Ali Khamenei. In response, Hezbollah resumed rocket strikes on Israel. Israel responded with airstrikes across Lebanon, including the capital Beirut, and began ground operations in southern Lebanon on March 16th, eventually deploying 5 divisions. 5 full divisions of the Israel Defense Forces poured into southern Lebanon. That is not a limited operation. That is a full-scale ground war. And almost immediately, the battle converged on the same place it always converges, Bint Jbeil. The battle began on April 9, 2026, coinciding with the second day of the Iran war ceasefire as part of a broader Israeli offensive against Hezbollah that included the April 8 attacks and other operations across southern Lebanon. Iran, Pakistan, and Hezbollah stated that the ceasefire extended to Lebanon and characterized Israeli operations as violations of the agreement. In contrast, Israel and the United States maintained that the ceasefire did not apply to the Lebanese front, and therefore considered continued military operations against Hezbollah to be legitimate. Let that sink in for a moment. There is a ceasefire with Iran. The guns have stopped over Tehran. But in Lebanon, the IDF is still pushing forward, still fighting, still bombing, and the justification is a legal distinction that most people in Lebanon and the broader Arab world regard as a fig leaf. This is the kind of thing that breeds generational resentment, and you need to understand it to understand why this conflict never truly ends. Now let's talk about what the IDF actually tried to do in Bint Jbeil, because the strategy is revealing. The IDF adopted a strategy of avoiding immediate direct confrontation in significant urban centers and instead opted to encircle them by securing locations around them and issuing strategic displacement orders for the local populations. Houses in nearby towns were dismantled to secure IDF positions, and the army secured locations near and within Aitaron and Ainata to the east and south, from Aita al-Shab toward the outskirts of Hadatta in the north. This is the classic siege doctrine. Cut off the supply lines, displace the population, tighten the noose, then move in. It worked in some contexts during the Gaza operations. The IDF believed it would work here too. They were wrong. And the reasons why tell us something important about the nature of this terrain and this particular opponent. For weeks, Israel bombarded Bint Jbeil and Qiyam, repeatedly attempting to encircle the southern Lebanese towns. Yet neither fully fell to Israel's invading military. The survival of these Hezbollah redoubts, which have long carried symbolic and strategic weight, expose the limits of what Israeli firepower is able to achieve in South Lebanon, and the strategic power the terrain holds for its defenders. That is not a small statement. That is a structural admission about the limits of military power when it meets a sufficiently prepared, sufficiently motivated, and sufficiently terrain-advantaged adversary. And Hezbollah has spent 20 years literally 2 decades, building that advantage in the hills and valleys of southern Lebanon. 3 sources close to Hezbollah, including one intimately familiar with the battles in the south, described to Middle East Eye how Israel was unable to dislodge the Lebanese armed movement. One source said everything the Israelis claimed about enforcing a total siege on the town was inaccurate. There was pressure from several directions, yes, but even in the final moments, supplies and ammunition were still reaching us through the surrounding axes, the second source said. The source added that Bint Jbeil remained an operations hub from which attacks were launched into other areas, arguing that no force in the world can impose a total siege on our terrain in this area. Now you can take that statement with some skepticism if you want, because of course Hezbollah has its own narrative interest in projecting strength. But the physical reality on the ground, the fact that IDF troops were still fighting for weeks, that the town never submitted, that rockets kept flying, all of that validates the core claim. The siege was never total, and Bint Jbeil never broke. Think about what the IDF's own internal statements reveal. A Hezbollah official said that without the Israelis being able to capture Bint Jbeil, it cannot connect its incursions into Lebanon, less than 10 kilometers away from one another. They also cannot connect them across the width of the front from Nakura to the eastern sector. Therefore, it will be unable to put in place an occupation similar to the pre-2000 border strip. This is the strategic heart of the whole thing. Bint Jbeil is not just symbolically important, it is the geographic linchpin. If you cannot take it, you cannot connect your forward positions across southern Lebanon. You end up with a collection of isolated pockets of control rather than a coherent buffer zone. And a buffer zone made of isolated pockets is not really a buffer zone at all. It is a series of ambush opportunities. Israeli armored units advanced along the Bint Jbeil highway near the Alawaini neighborhood in an attempt to reach the local stadium. They reportedly approached to within approximately 300 to 400 meters of the stadium's perimeter before their advance was confronted by resistance from Hezbollah forces. Hezbollah fired a barrage of rockets against IDF positions at the Motalat al-Tahrir site in the town, the latest of the 3 attacks being at around 5 p.m. local time. So here you have Israeli armor, one of the most technologically sophisticated armored forces in the world, pressing toward a symbolic target, a soccer stadium, and being stopped within 400 meters by a non-state armed movement using rockets and guerrilla tactics. That image alone speaks volumes. Now, the IDF will tell you, and mainstream media will dutifully repeat, that the operation was largely a success. They will cite numbers. The IDF said it initially isolated and encircled the town to prevent Hezbollah from bringing in reinforcements or escaping. At least 150 Hezbollah operatives, including members of the terror group's elite Radwan force, were estimated by the IDF to have been in the Bint Jbeil area ahead of the operation. The troops eliminated more than 100 terrorists from the Hezbollah terror organization in close quarters combat and from the air, destroyed dozens of terrorist infrastructures, and located hundreds of weapons in the area. And those numbers may well be accurate, but here is what you need to understand about casualty counts and infrastructure destruction as metrics of military success. They tell you what you destroyed, not whether you achieved your strategic objective. Think about it this way. The United States spent 20 years in Afghanistan. The American military killed hundreds of thousands of Taliban fighters, destroyed countless weapons caches, dismantled countless command structures, and yet when America withdrew in 2021, the Taliban walked back into Kabul in days. Why? Because destroying a non-state armed movement's assets is not the same thing as destroying its will, its organization, its community embeddedness, or its ability to regenerate. Hezbollah has been getting hammered by Israel since 2024. Its top commanders have been killed in repeated waves. Since the start of Operation Roaring Lion in late February 2026, more than 1,800 Hezbollah terrorists have been killed in Lebanon according to military numbers. 1,800 fighters killed, and Bint Jbeil still did not fall. That tells you something fundamental about the organization you are dealing with. The strategy of Hezbollah has always been to draw Israel's forces deep into Lebanese territory in order to ambush them and wage a guerrilla war that eventually forces the occupying power to withdraw. The survival of Bint Jbeil confirms this logic. This is not a new playbook. It is the same playbook that defeated Israel in 2000, that blunted Israel in 2006, and that is now complicating Israel's plans in 2026. The terrain is the weapon, the urban environment is the weapon, the tunnel networks, the hidden supply routes, the intimate local knowledge, these are all weapons. and they are weapons that no amount of F-35 sorties or artillery barrages can simply neutralize, because they are embedded in the very geography and community fabric of the place. Now let me talk about something that often gets lost in the military analysis, and that is the symbolic dimension. Because in the Middle East, more than almost anywhere else, symbolism drives behavior and shapes outcomes just as much as military hardware. Bint Jbeil carries a particular kind of weight. At every round of fighting, there has always been the question of Bint Jbeil for the Israelis, a source close to Hezbollah said. The city has haunted the Israelis and created some sort of PTSD. Now that is a striking phrase, military PTSD about a small Lebanese town, but think about it from the Israeli military establishment's perspective. 3 times now, in 2000, in 2006, and in 2026, they have gone after this place. 3 times it has not yielded the way they hoped. The 98th Division commander, Brigadier General Guy Levy, sent a missive to troops saying, Bint Jbeil 2000. There was someone here who spoke and boasted about webs and spiders. Today that man no longer exists, the stadium is gone, and his words are worth nothing. Bint Jbeil 2026, our forces control the area, destroying terror infrastructure and dozens of terrorists. Notice the defensiveness in that statement. You do not need to psychologically rebut a speech from a dead man unless that speech still resonates, unless the idea it expressed is still alive. And it is still alive, because Hezbollah held Bint Jbeil again. Let's zoom out now and look at the bigger picture, because Bint Jbeil does not exist in isolation. It is one piece of a much larger puzzle that includes the Iran war, the American role in the region, and the broader question of what the post-Khamenei Middle East looks like. The main bridges on the Litani River were blown up by Israel to cut off the south from the rest of Lebanon. The southern town of Bint Jbeil became the main site of ground combat, culminating in a battle. On March 24th, the Israeli defense minister announced that Israel would demolish Lebanese border settlements and occupy southern Lebanon up to the Litani River. So Israel has announced its intention to occupy up to the Litani. That is a buffer zone doctrine. The idea is that by controlling the terrain south of the Litani River, Israel can prevent Hezbollah from threatening northern Israeli towns like Kiryat Shmona, Nahariya, and Haifa with short-range rockets and drone strikes. The problem with that doctrine, and this is the core strategic dilemma that Bint Jbeil illustrates so vividly, is that occupation creates resistance. Every house demolished, every family displaced, every civilian killed in an airstrike, every checkpoint that stops a farmer from reaching his fields, all of that becomes the fuel for the next generation of fighters. Israel learned this between 1982 and 2000 during its first occupation of southern Lebanon. It created Hezbollah. The occupation literally created the organization that has been Israel's most capable adversary for 40 years. And now Israel is back, occupying the same territory, demolishing the same kinds of buildings, displacing the same kinds of families. According to the World Bank, 209 houses were damaged during the conflict, of which 18% were destroyed. UN Habitat reported that 27% of buildings in Marjayun and 15% of buildings in Bint Jbeil were damaged or destroyed. Those are not just statistics. Those are human lives uprooted, livelihoods destroyed, communities shattered. And in the political culture of southern Lebanon, those experiences do not produce submission, they produce recruitment. Now here is where the American dimension becomes critically important for you as someone watching this from the United States. Because America is not a passive observer here, the ceasefire is being monitored by a panel of 5 countries, led by the United States, though Israel retains the right to strike at immediate threats in Lebanon during this period. America co-signed the ceasefire, America co-defined the terms, America is participating in the architecture of this conflict, and when Hezbollah or Lebanon's government or the broader Arab world looks at the American posture in Lebanon, what they see is an America that enables Israeli operations while nominally presiding over a peace process. That credibility gap matters enormously for American influence in the region long term. When the United States is seen as a co-belligerent rather than an honest broker, it loses the ability to shape outcomes diplomatically. And once you lose that diplomatic leverage, what you have left is military leverage. And military leverage, as Bint Jbeil keeps demonstrating, has real limits. US President Donald Trump said that the ceasefire would be extended by 3 weeks, while noting that Israel could carry out strikes in Lebanon in self-defense. Netanyahu said Israel was maintaining full freedom of action against any threat in Lebanon. So we have a ceasefire that is not really a ceasefire. We have a peace framework within which a war continues. and we have an American president signing off on that framework, this is not a cynical observation, it is just an accurate description of the situation on the ground. And Americans who care about their country's long-term credibility and strategic position in the Middle East should be paying very close attention to this, because the decisions being made right now will shape the region for the next generation. Let's also think about what the Battle of Bint Jbeil means for Hezbollah's strategic standing. Because there is a narrative that was very popular in Western media from late 2024 through 2025, which held that Hezbollah had been decisively weakened, that its command structure had been shattered by Israeli strikes, that it was on the verge of collapse as a military organization. Sources close to Hezbollah say the movement views Israel's inability to cut off the wider Bint Jbeil district as a significant battlefield success. And this is not just spin, the military facts support it. Hezbollah held Bint Jbeil under conditions of massive Israeli firepower. It maintained supply lines under siege. It continued to launch rocket attacks throughout the battle. Hezbollah claimed responsibility for carrying out 43 military operations against Israeli positions and troop concentrations on a single Sunday, saying the strikes were in response to alleged ceasefire violations and continued Israeli military activity in Lebanon. 43 operations in a single day from an organization that was supposed to be on its last legs. That is not collapse. That is adaptation. And this brings us to what I think is perhaps the most important insight from the entire Bint Jbeil episode, and it is one that applies far beyond this specific conflict. Non-state armed movements that are deeply embedded in their communities, that have ideological coherence, that have spent decades studying their adversaries' tactics and adapting to them, that have terrain advantages and supply network flexibility, these organizations do not fight and die the way conventional armies do. They do not have a headquarters you can bomb to stop them. They do not have a chain of command you can decapitate permanently. They regenerate, they adapt, they learn. Sources say that Hezbollah studied Israel's tactics in Gaza and prepared accordingly. What began as an attempt to isolate an entire area became an attempt to besiege a single town. That was not a minor tactical adjustment. That is a devastating commentary on the progression of the Israeli operation. They went in with a grand strategic plan and came out with a much more modest tactical achievement, and even that modest achievement is contested. So where does this leave us? What should you, as an American trying to understand the real dynamics of what is happening in the Middle East, take away from the Battle of Bint Jbeil? Here is what I think it tells us. It tells us that the Middle East is not bending to the will of military power the way the architects of these operations hope it will. The survival of these Hezbollah redoubts exposed the limits of what Israeli firepower is able to achieve in South Lebanon and the strategic power the terrain holds for its defenders. That failure poses questions for any long-term Israeli presence in Lebanon's south. Those questions are not comfortable ones for the policymakers in Jerusalem or Washington. They are questions about whether the current strategy is actually producing lasting security, or whether it is producing a rolling cycle of destruction and regeneration that benefits no one except the people who profit from perpetual war. It also tells us something about the nature of information in the modern world, because if you had only watched the mainstream coverage of this battle, you would have come away with the impression of a clean IDF operation, targets hit, terrorists killed, mission accomplished, moving on. The messier reality of a siege that was never total, of a town that never broke, of supply lines that kept flowing, of a force that held against everything the IDF threw at it, that reality required digging, required multiple sources, required the willingness to sit with complexity rather than settle for a simple narrative. And that is exactly what most Americans are not given the time or the tools to do, which is precisely why conversations like this one matter. Bint Jbeil is a small place on the map, but the questions it raises are enormous. They are questions about the durability of military-first strategies. They are questions about the cost of occupation to the occupier over time. They are questions about American complicity and credibility. They are questions about the nature of resistance and what sustains it across decades. They are questions about who gets to define victory and who has to live with the consequences of that definition long after the cameras have moved on. The ultimate resolution of the Bint Jbeil situation will likely influence broader regional stability and the future relationship between Israel and Lebanon, making it a development of significance extending far beyond immediate tactical considerations. And those of us watching from the United States, paying for much of this with our tax dollars and our diplomatic capital, have both the right and the responsibility to understand what is actually happening there, stripped of propaganda, stripped of comfortable narratives, stripped of the kind of lazy analysis that mistakes destruction for victory. Bint Jbeil has not fallen, and that fact is a lesson the world should be paying far more attention to than it currently is. What you're about to hear is not a story the mainstream media wants to tell you clearly, because if it did, it would force Americans to ask some very uncomfortable questions about what their government is actually supporting in the Middle East right now, and more importantly, what this moment means for the future of the entire region and America's place in it. Pay close attention, because what is unfolding in the small Lebanese town of Bint Jbeil is not just another military skirmish on the edge of the world. It is a mirror, and what it reflects back at us says something profound about power, about resistance, about the nature of modern war, and about who really controls the narrative that shapes your understanding of global events. This is one of those moments in history where the fog of war and the fog of media collide, and if you are not careful, you will walk away believing the exact opposite of what is actually happening on the ground. So let's slow down, let's go deep. Let's talk about Bint Jbeil, what it means, why it keeps coming back, and what the battle unfolding there right now tells us about the shifting tectonic plates of Middle Eastern power, American foreign policy, and the military limits of even the most sophisticated armed forces on the planet. Let's start with the basics, because context is everything in geopolitics, and most of what you see in headlines is stripped of context deliberately. Bint Jbeil is a town in southern Lebanon, sitting in the Nabatea Governorate, close to the Israeli border. It is sometimes referred to as the capital of the resistance, home to around 30,000 residents before the current war began. But its significance goes far beyond population size or geography. This is a town that has been burned into the consciousness of the Israeli military establishment for decades, and when you understand why, everything else starts to make sense. Go back to the year 2000.